Okay, I guess I owe you guys some context with this one, so here it is. In Tales of Atonement Glitch, there is a loosely organized group of people who see themselves as the last people willing to keep order for the American way when everything falls apart. This is the story of a militarized group that's existed in our writings since at least 2005. This is the unfortunately long history of the Eagles. In the year 2000, everything changed for the worst. Following a nuclear strike on New York and the activation of the Y2K bug, the world was thrown into darkness and chaos. At first, many refused to accept it. The glitch was temporary. The outages were caused by some other unknown factor or were just a coincidence. But in the dead of winter, in many places, this sort of situation gets dangerous fast. Places that can resort to power generators do, and the ones that don't quickly become abandoned in the cold. Hospitals became graveyards. Those who were dependent on 24/7 life support or surveillance are not able to survive an outage lasting much more than a few days, to a week at best. Authorities get called in to quell riots, the looting, the people just trying to survive, but police and regular law enforcement get overwhelmed fast, and volunteer recruitment, the deputization of citizens, begins. By the end of January that year, the force known as the Eagles was born. To define the Eagles, we have to look at how they were staffed. Staffed. I use that term loosely. Law enforcement, like cops, military personnel, prison wardens, border patrol agents, were at the top of the lists. However, just below them were the doomsday preppers and conspiracy theorists that had been preparing for such an eventuality. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that every American citizen with a stockpile of guns in his basement became a paramilitary enforcer. But just between you and me, you already kind of know the sort of person who would do that. White supremacists, Christian nationalists, apocalyptic fanatics who feel that this is the start of the rapture, or that by participating they are facilitating some sort of messianic second coming. And those are the ones who turn dangerous. So what happened exactly? They didn't start out as villains necessarily. They were relief. People were freezing. First responders were overwhelmed. All that was needed was bodies in the field trying to preserve a nation that had just been torn asunder. But in that desperation, vetting checks and background information disappeared. Without access to legal records, many were taken at their word only to gain the information and access to weaponry and supplies. By spring of 2000, relief turned to enforcing the order of the United States under a nationalist view where nuance no longer existed. Human rights, secondary. All that mattered was survival and upholding the law. These were the people who watched the nuclear strike on New Year's Eve that decimated Times Square and decided, this is our time to shine. And so they took up arms, called themselves a militia, and enacted a sort of extrajudicial control that sought to rein in outgroups that were just trying to survive. Despite the fractured nation dealing with complete power outages, communication blackouts, and a perceived threat of invasion, they sought to preserve the country in their own image and to do it with force. The Eagles were easily separated into cells depending on where in the country they were located, but all of them seemed to share a common goal and a common name. This led many to speculate that the Eagles were a force that had been radicalized for quite some time for just this sort of purpose. They set up checkpoints and would even rove into neighborhoods, terrorizing survivors with a shoddy, half-cooked assemblage of weaponry and military-style gear, everything from hunting rifles and illegal firearms to Kevlar armor down to flannel and jeans. By now, I'm probably painting a stereotype in your head, and that's not my intention. These are just the facts of history in my timeline. Communities who started policing themselves, surviving without aid, and even rejecting help from the government cells were seen as dangerous. Communists, socialists, anti-American ideas. And so, those that were left began calling themselves Eagles. given not only the imagery of America's symbolic bird, but also the notation of a bird of prey, one that swoops in, kills, takes its meal elsewhere, and discards the remains. It's those talons that sank into the citizenry trying to live, and sparked many conflicts throughout the country. In the years following the blast, the shutdowns, and the apocalypse, as it were, became the harshest the nation had to weather. Leadership was gone. Much of Washington, D.C. had been evacuated and regrouped to Anchorage, Alaska, still leaving many communities in the continental states to the whims of these violent groups. Without money, without real authority, the Eagles ruled through fear and conquest. They were kind of like Vikings or pirates, but in the realistic way, not the glamorized Hollywood Travis Fimmel, Orlando Bloom sort of way. The Eagles were pillagers in their own castles of former prisons, police stations, and military compounds. Sure, none of the computer systems or electricity worked, but the cold hardware of guns and armor still did. It wasn't until 2003 that the government finally stepped in and did anything to stop the threat the Eagles posed. Special operatives trained by a former police officer in Georgia arrived not with guns and bullets and tanks, but with a magical arsenal that dominated the factions who, until now, denied this power's very existence. Now, of course, officially, there's still no such thing as magic. But come on now, people, there are plenty of things our governments tell us don't officially exist. It's just their way of denying it in the paperwork. So the Eagles clashed with the ACE agents, that's Arcane Civility Enforcement, a sort of peace through superior firepower, when that firepower is things like conjuring windstorms and calling out bolts of pure fire. The Eagles were left with no other choice but to surrender or to run and hide. Those that were caught were rehabilitated under new reformative justice laws and integrated back into society. Those that weren't caught, they further separated from society, becoming self-contained splinter factions that, while having no real power or authority, still maintained a high level of structured nihilism around the idea that the world is in turmoil, the country is in chaos, and only they can save it. And the focus began to shift. Eagles began targeting magic users, not just humans but fey beings as well. This began in St. Louis and spread out from there, where following the societal collapse, many creatures once thought to be myth began spreading throughout the globe. Many of them returned to their ancestral homes, old forests and bogs, but those that returned and found these places destroyed or usurped turned to new territory. The ACE wanted no involvement with the fairy court, and while it maintained a focus on order with the citizenry, warnings going out to ignore magical creatures and not engaging with them became a total cover-up of their existence and formed the Magical Intervention Bureau. This agency was initially constructed to put an arm between humanity and the Fae, but over the course of 2 decades, conflict became inevitable in some cases, and in those cases, you could always find former Eagles willing to take up the fighting. After what happened in St. Louis, their efforts redoubled away from citizens and survivors and towards becoming a sort of witch hunter force. They were the modern-day dragon slayers, vampire hunters, and fairy killers. The more organized factions would secure fairy communes in an effort to contain the spread of magical influence throughout the country. In those days, magic was still taboo. Many refused to believe in its existence. The Eagles were known to arrest or kill practitioners of magic, feeling they were under the influence of a fairy cult. Largely, the Fae had no vested interest in ushering a new magical era of humanity. However, sometimes deals would be struck, and people would uncover the secrets of true freedom. Magic is the truest freedom of expression, guys. It's a manifestation of your psyche, in a way that, while most forms of magic are vastly different, all come from the same sort of emotional control. To control magic is to control one's emotions entirely. Most Eagles were not capable of controlling magic, and so they feared it, called it degenerate, and hunted it down. By 2030, many former and current Eagles had infiltrated the rank of the Magical Intervention Bureau, using it as an excuse to fight, hunt, and even kill magical creatures or even humans using magical powers. These actions were always not part of the Bureau's intent or aims. However, they were listed as unavoidable conflicts, with little way to prove the contrary. Many of those destroyed in this way were unseelie by even the fairy court standards, and thus fighting was seen as a likely scenario. It wasn't until the 2050s that the Eagles became a full-fledged force again under a tech genius that used their militarized power to become his personal army. Was a trusted individual to many. Honestly, it's surprising to many who knew him how far he fell, but they say power corrupts. During this era of Eagle activity, formed the Emerald Eagle, a centralized unit of collective power with one aim: globalization. Not only did the Emerald Eagle consist of American-made operatives, but operatives from all across the planet were called from different factions in order to join this mounting force. Eagles were sent out into the world as a sort of paramilitary outfit. Given better armor, better weapons, and more coordination, they began to target areas where Fey activity was common. Liminal spaces, old warehouses, crossroads, abandoned buildings, empty parking lots, and underused subways. Anywhere that humans weren't was teeming with Fey, and their goal was to keep the two as separate as possible. In 2070, the Eagles began using technological enhancements to power up their soldiers. These were mostly exosuits at the time, but actual cybernetics would come later. This was, of course, in an attempt to begin holding ground against the encroach of magical powers that were vastly superior to technology, especially when dealing with the Fae. Any Eagle found using magic was not only excommunicated, many of them would execute their own, which gave a bad name to the entire secularist movement and transhuman rights. With AI advancements, the Eagles claimed they could suss out Fae and humans. They could always tell which were humans using magic and which were actual Fae, and would even detain magic users in special facilities. However, these facilities quickly became magical hubs because the Eagles lacked the ability, by refusing to use magic, to stop people from using it. Short of just killing them, but it was extremely difficult to keep up with. Then, in 2072, everything collapsed again. Something happened to the International Space Station, and the Emerald Eagle and all of its power and influence vanished. The shell of their organizations were left intact on the surface, but the central hub of leadership and control had grown dark, cold, silent, and distant. Like, from orbit distant. Without this force, communities began to heal. Humanity embraced magic, each other, and enjoyed over a century of unhindered progress. Then, in 2181, the spaceship woke up. A connection was established with the ISS, but then quickly shut off again. They were there. They were active. They weren't responding. Shuttle ships began to descend to the surface, calling all former Eagle operatives and even collecting new recruits, as many of the former forces had died out from old age or other complications. But what do you want? It was over a century later. Of course these people didn't exist anymore. Many saw this action as the rapture, and it was dubbed the Eagle's return to the sky. And then, Atonement fell. Formerly Cleveland, Ohio, Atonement overtook much of the entire state, and within its borders, dark Fae forces had been festering for ages. This is when the day became eternal night, vampires roamed free, and other evil forces began to take charge. For 41 years, Atonement crumbled. Cut off from the rest of the country, those that tried to leave were hunted, and those that came to try and stop were met with fierce fighters that only saw joy in suffering. The Emerald Eagle arrived to the fight, and their forces did well. They held their own against the vampires and unseelie fairies with an impressive array of technological warfare that would have made the Doomslayer proud. However, they weren't prepared for the Master Vampire. Some call him the origin of murder itself, and I won't say his name because I do not want to get caught up in that shit. The Master Vampire had with him the Key of Solomon, and he unleashed the full force of it against the Emerald Eagle. This fight was a literal hell on earth. We're talking brimstone, demons, screaming and suffering, monsters you've never even heard of versus a force only trained to deal with supernatural entities. But this was an entirely different class. But in humanity's bleakest time, when it looked like nothing would stop the forces of evil from dominating completely, the dragons arrived, led by their god king Bahamut and the mother of monsters, Tiamat. Once again, the Eagles had been defeated and relegated to the background while Fae forces fought for the survival of humanity. Now, this isn't so much like D&D, where different colored dragons all have a similar disposition and wants and needs and so on. That feels counterintuitive and even a little deductive. The truth is that the Fae aren't as bioessentialistic as some pop culture myths would have you believe. Still, there are commonalities. Red dragons breathe fire, blue dragons breathe lightning, green dragons breathe gas, black dragons spit acid, and white dragons use ice. Now, how do you guys feel about ice? Personally, as a pyromancer, I don't like ice. Ice makes me uncomfortable. Every time I see a lot of ice, I feel unsafe. Like I just want to melt it. So yeah, no ice for me. Unless it's crushed in my drink. I could crush ice all day. Cube ice, crunch ice, you get the idea. Following their defeat, the Eagles' tactics turned even more deadly. They began a full-on magical genocide that targeted every magic user and fairy creature that crossed into Atonement's borders. Why they were so gung-ho about Ohio specifically, I couldn't say. So the Eagles are bullies, and in the worst possible kind. What's more is, sometimes a random loser will throw on a costume and pick up a gun pretending to be an eagle, just so he can feel like he's got a shield of anonymity.
I'm not an eagle.
But, yeah, so, as you might have guessed, the Eagles are still active, even as far as 400 years into the future. Although these days they're even worse. Eagles are selected from a crop of humans designed to fight the Fae. Explicitly, they're there to keep the vampires and other unseelie forces in check in Atonement, but all they are is fighters. There's no humanitarianism to the Eagles. They don't help people who have been trafficked by vampires. They don't bring clothing or blankets or food or medicine. They bring shows of force, weapons, and unremittent, almost sociopathic cruelty that if I compared it to the fucking vampires, I don't know which is worse. These assholes have attacked Andrew before. They've side-eyed Bree and I, which is how we get to this picture. It was a recent outing in Atonement, and Bree and I were there looking for the Waffle House. Look, I can't explain it. The coffee there can't be from this dimension. I straight up think they make it with that almond water from the back rooms or something. So we went for coffee, and the rule in Atonement is that you never go anywhere unless you're in a group of 3. Ostensibly, for defensive purposes. Bree and I aren't really fighters, but I can still use fire, and let's be so for real. This is only her human form. You guys have not seen the real Bree yet. And her brother, who I'll call Leas for now, would not leave us alone until we agreed to bring him as a third. Leas can be a jerk. He's a bully. But at the same time, he takes no shit, no names, and no prisoners. We were leaving the Waffle House when a group of 5 eagles rolled by in a van. One of them, hanging out the window, took a long look at Bree's horns, probably trying to figure out if she was a fiendling or a dragon in disguise. As soon as the van rolled to a stop, Leas was out in front. "You assholes better keep rolling!" or something like that. I was already trying not to overheat. I just wanted some damn coffee. Bree had me by the shoulders. She was turning us both the other way, pushed me low, and we skittered behind a rusted-out car when Leas went nuts on these guys. 3 of them at first jumped out of the van, weapons drawn. Leas smiled. Oh, that damn smile. You always know he's about to pull some absolutely ridiculous violence whenever he smiles like that. He iced the inside of the van. Driver and front passenger were frozen solid in seconds. The other 3 tried to shoot, and he literally freaking laughs. Like, bullets? You guys can't afford plasma bolts? It was over pretty shortly after that. I looked up, and he had this guy on spikes as big as his freaking body. I could not deal. There was so much blood. I didn't include it in this version because I figured YouTube would demonetize the video, but, like, it was hard to tell where the frozen bits were actually just ice or just purely frozen blood. Crazy. And there was Leas, still grinning, looking that guy right in the eye, watching it all fade. And despite the violence, despite the worry, despite anything else in my head in that moment, I watched someone who I'd call the absolute menace of our generation stand up against a force even worse than that. Remember, this is the guy I compared to Dio freaking Brando, a man so evil and unrepentantly cruel that the first thing he did when meeting Jonathan was to bloody his nose and kill his dog. Now, there's a thing about that, and this might seem like a wild tangent, but hear me out. The reason why Hirohiko Araki has so many people who kill dogs in JoJo's is because, in his opinion, people who kill dogs are shorthand evil. It's the easiest, fastest way in that style to label a character as a villain, someone who cannot be trusted or redeemed. And I've never seen Lias kill a dog, but I have seen eagles kill them. How can you ever trust a human who would kill a dog in cold blood? Despicable. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to leave the commentary there. We don't support extrajudicial murders carried out by state powers on their citizens. We don't support inhumane imprisonment, human trafficking, or abject cruelty being meted out by a corrupt and fascistic world power. And if that sort of assertion offends you, here's what I want you to do. I want you to find the nearest mirror and look into it. I want you to ask yourself 3 very important questions. In 10 years, will I look back on these decisions with pride? Who am I willing to sacrifice to the government? And would it still be justified if this happened to someone I knew? Because a government given carte blanche to arrest anyone it disagrees with is authoritarian at best, totalitarian in practice, and fascist at its core. If you like this video, check the link below to our Fourth Wall store and buy a frickin' shirt. The slogan is inspired by the Capitol Hill organized protest, also known as the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, a protest that happened in June of 2020 in the Capitol Hill neighborhood in Seattle. During this time, protesters took to the streets as part of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to the death of George Floyd. Police were ejected from the neighborhood, and it became a self-governed place without any official leadership. In fact, it became one of the first communist neighborhoods in modern history. Of course, attacks on the Chaz became popular. Some right-wing sources started spreading terroristic propaganda about going to the CHOP in order to enact violence on people there because they felt the lack of police presence would give them the ability to murder or rape or assault people, and there were a few cases of this. To say nothing of how the CHOP ended when Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkin launched an attack on the Chaz with over 100 police units as well as backup from the FBI. However, protests continued even after the zone was disbanded. What does this have to do with today's modern problems? All I'm saying is that with such a strong anti-police settlement in Seattle, I hope they bring the same energy if government agencies looking to terrorize neighborhoods on behalf of a corrupt system of Epstein-class predators come prowling, as they are wont to do. I want to thank every one of you once again this week for coming to these ramblings of an anxiety-ridden pyromancer.
And her dragon best friend. We're a small team just doing our best to bring our stories we've loved for decades and hope they're the kind you like too.
With a side info dump of psychology, lore, history, and social awareness.
If this is your first video, we hope you'll stay for another one. And maybe you could consider becoming a subscriber. We'd love to see you again.
Our subscribers can move mountains for a channel like this. The engagement we get just keeps growing each week. You guys are getting the word out and people are listening.
And we really can't express how grateful we are to see our passion project take off. 20 years of love and dedication are here laid bare. Help as much as you care to, but at least watch and talk with us.
Of course, we can't close out a video without giving a shout out to our patrons. Emily Masternardi,
Heinrich 28,
Pammy Poo,
JC Moreland,
Shadow Fox,
Charles Tam,
Arya Gamari,
Lundair Lumen. But also don't forget our channel members, Moose Now,
Jack McLeod,
Plebe 64 Potato.
Lunder Lumen.
7-star Sanctuary.
And Chained Furry. Many a mickle maximuckle.
See you next week.